HOA police claim black resident is a drug dealer. Facts show he was set up. The afternoon sun stretched gently across the neighborhood, draping everything in a warm, golden glow. The air was thick with the familiar scent of freshly cut grass, drifting lazily between rows of tidy homes lined up like painted postcards. Sprinklers ticked rhythmically, sending arcs of water glistening in the light, and children's laughter echoed faintly as bicycles rattled down the smooth asphalt street. It was a scene of ordinary suburban calm, the kind of moment when time seemed to exhale and settle into quiet comfort. At the end of one row of houses stood David's home. His front yard was modest but carefully kept, each blade of grass trimmed, the small flower bed along the porch bursting with bursts of color marigolds and petunias that brightened the wooden brick facade. David took pride in that yard, though not for appearances alone. For him, order and care were a way to push back against a world that often tried to paint him otherwise. David was in his early 40s, his build average but steady, the kind of frame shaped more by long days of practical work than by exercise. His skin, a deep brown with warm undertones, glistened lightly under the afternoon light. His short-cropped black hair, flecked now with threads of gray at the temples, made him appear older than he was, but it lent him a quiet dignity. His face carried the calm of a man who had long practiced patience, with eyes that softened when neighbors greeted him and a smile that was slow but genuine. On this day, he wore a simple light blue polo shirt, neat despite the small crease from sitting on the porch railing earlier, paired with dark jeans and well-kept sneakers. He carried himself as he always did, tidy, polite, approachable. To many, he was the sort of neighbor who seemed woven into the rhythm of community life. When the older woman 2 houses down struggled with her groceries, it was David who appeared, offering to carry the bags with ease. When a child's bike chain slipped loose, it was David who knelt on the pavement, fixing it with steady hands while the child watched in wide-eyed gratitude. Even the grumpiest residents could not deny his quiet helpfulness. That afternoon, he was tending to the small patch of soil near the walkway, adjusting the flowers that leaned too heavily toward the sun. He knelt there for a long moment, brushing soil from his palms, then sat back on his heels, breathing in the air. There was peace in such work, peace he had learned to create for himself. But underneath that peace was also a longing, one he rarely spoke of. David knew what it meant to be seen differently, to feel eyes linger too long for the wrong reasons. Even in this neighborhood, where he had lived for years, there was a kind of glass wall. Many respected him, even liked him, but some carried a quiet reservation, a stiffness in their smile, as though they were measuring his place against their own. David never let it embitter him. Instead, he doubled down on kindness, on responsibility, on being the man who helped without hesitation. The neighborhood around him thrummed with simple life. A boy pedaled past on a red bicycle, calling out a cheerful hello. Across the street, a man adjusted a sprinkler while his dog barked happily at the water spray. Somewhere, a lawnmower hummed faintly. All of it folded together into a kind of harmony, a suburban orchestra of sound and light. David stood, brushing his jeans, and leaned on the porch railing, surveying the quiet world around him. In that moment, he felt a rare sense of belonging. This house, this yard, this street, this was home, his sanctuary. He had worked for it, cared for it, and built his life here. The walls of the house held his history, the yard reflected his hands, and the porch carried his quiet hopes. What he could not know was how fragile that peace truly was. The soft afternoon light that warmed his face, the children's laughter that echoed faintly, and the stillness of his yard, all of it would soon be overshadowed. Rumors had already begun to stir. Shadows were already watching him. And though he could not yet sense it, the very home he had poured his dignity into was about to be threatened in a way he had never imagined. For now, though the afternoon held its breath, and David, standing calmly at his porch, remained unaware that his sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. The afternoon warmth lingered, yet an unfamiliar tension began to ripple through the neighborhood. The soft hum of sprinklers and distant laughter no longer felt completely comforting. Along the quiet sidewalks, two figures moved deliberately, their presence sharp and deliberate against the backdrop of suburban calm. They were the self-styled HOA police volunteers with authority in their own eyes, men and women who carried clipboards, walkie-talkies, and the kind of rigid posture that commanded attention. David noticed them first as a faint disturbance on the edge of his vision while tending to his flower bed. They whispered to one another, leaning close, glances flicking toward his home. A finger pointed subtly in his direction, followed by nods and murmured conversation he could not hear from the porch, yet their intent was unmistakable. The air around him seemed to thicken, as if the sunlight itself had grown heavier. Neighbors who once waved cheerfully or exchanged casual nods now seemed hesitant. Smiles faltered and hands lingered in pockets. One woman paused mid-step, her grocery bag swinging, and cast a quick, wary glance toward David's front yard. A man across the street mumbled a greeting, but his voice lacked warmth, carrying instead a brittle edge that made David's stomach twist. The subtle, almost imperceptible shift in their demeanor was enough to send a ripple of unease through his chest. David straightened, brushing the dirt from his hands, his gaze sweeping the street. He had lived here for years, and the rhythm of neighborhood life had always been predictable. Children played under his watchful eyes. Neighbors waved and borrowed sugar. Friendly nods and small talk marked the passage of days. But now those rhythms felt fractured. Each glance from a neighbor seemed laden with suspicion, each whisper like a tiny hammer striking at the walls of comfort he had built, did not yet know the full measure of what was coming. The first warning came in a more formal form, a slip of paper affixed to his door with neat, impersonal handwriting. David approached slowly, his pulse quickening as he read the words. He was under suspicion of dealing drugs. The notice felt like a thunderclap, shattering the afternoon's fragile calm. The crisp paper, pinned to his door by a small pushpin, carried the weight of accusation, of judgment rendered before he had a chance to speak. Shock rippled through him, leaving a bitter taste at the back of his throat. His eyes darted around the street as if to find some explanation in the familiar sights of his neighborhood. Sprinklers arced lazily over the grass. Children laughed a few houses down, but the ordinary world seemed to blur around the edges of this new reality. How could they see him this way? How could those who barely knew him, and those who had lived quietly alongside him, assume guilt without a single word from him? David pressed a hand to the door, steadying himself, though his heart pounded. The sunlight, once golden and comforting, now cast sharp shadows that seemed to stretch an accusation. The very home he had tended and nurtured, the sanctuary of his life, the symbol of years of care and integrity, had been transformed, in a single moment, into a stage for doubt and suspicion. Yet beneath the fear, a flicker of resolve ignited. David's hands clenched slightly at his sides. He had faced adversity before, and though this intrusion cut deep, he understood that strength would be required. The whispers of the HOA enforcers, the wary glances of neighbors, the cold formality of the notice, they would not define him. He would need to watch, to listen, and to wait, because the truth, as always, had a way of revealing itself, even when buried beneath lies. The quiet afternoon, once so comforting, had shifted. A shadow now lingered over David's street, and he could feel its weight pressing at the edges of his world. But as he stood there, staring at the notice pinned to his door, one thought remained steady. He would not bow to suspicion. Not yet, not without the truth to guide him. The sun hung high in the afternoon sky, bathing the street in bright, almost cruel clarity. David stepped onto his porch, the crisp light illuminating every corner of his yard, every blade of grass he had meticulously tended. Yet on this day, the warmth of the sun offered no comfort. Across the street, neighbors had begun to gather, curiosity pulling them out of their homes, some drawn by whispered rumors, others by the looming presence of authority. At the center of it all stood the HOA police, their clipboards in hand, their expressions stern and unyielding. They had crossed the line from casual enforcers into accusers, and David now felt the full weight of their scrutiny pressing against him. The taller enforcer, the man who had first been caught in whispers and shadowed corners, stepped forward, his face a mask of rigid certainty. "David Thompson," the enforcer said, voice flat but carried to the edges of the small crowd. "You are under suspicion of dealing illegal substances in this community." David froze, the words landing like icy stones in his chest. His hands, still gripping the railing, felt slick with sweat, though the afternoon remained warm. What are you talking about?" he managed, voice taut with disbelief. His eyes darted from the enforcer to the gathering neighbors, hoping for a flicker of understanding, a friendly face to anchor him, but found none. Their stares were blank, tentative, heavy with a mix of fear and curiosity. The enforcer held up a small plastic bag. It glinted under the sun, contents hidden but implied, sinister by association alone. "This was found near the community dumpster," he said, "with your address scribbled on a torn envelope inside. Evidence of your involvement." David's chest tightened. His hands dropped to his sides, trembling slightly as if the words themselves had grown weight. The small bag was absurd, ridiculous, and yet here it was, offered as proof of guilt. He felt a wave of anger bubble beneath the disbelief. That's not mine," he said, voice cracking slightly, each word weighted with hurt. "I have never touched drugs. I would never." But no one interrupted, no one questioned the enforcers. The silence of the neighbors pressed down on him more heavily than the accusations themselves. It was as if the absence of support was louder than the accusations, each quiet gaze a silent judgment he had not earned. David's eyes scanned the crowd, hoping to see even a flicker of recognition of his character, of the years of honesty, of the countless times he had offered help and kindness. But the streets, so familiar and warm before, now seemed alien, a stage set for his humiliation. His voice grew steadier, though the tightness in his chest did not relent. "You have no right," he said firmly, stepping slightly forward. "This is not true. I've never—" His words faltered again as the enforcer waved a hand, dismissing his protest. The bag of so-called evidence hung between them like a threat, a tangible symbol of suspicion. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact, glancing to one another for reassurance, while others whispered in hurried murmurs. The tension was almost physical, thick enough to make the air feel stifling. David's stomach churned with indignation, his pulse quickening, but beneath the panic, a flicker of resolve began to grow. This could not define him. These lies could not erase who he was. As the enforcers leaned closer, gesturing toward the bag and muttering details that seemed rehearsed, David took a deep breath, drawing on every ounce of calm he had cultivated over years of patient living. His words may have been caught between disbelief and anger, but his mind was already working, tracking, observing, preparing. He would not allow this moment to crush him. Not yet. Not without uncovering the truth that waited somewhere, hidden beneath shadows and lies. The sun continued to pour down on the street, relentless and bright, as if highlighting every injustice, every accusation, and every silent betrayal. And in its light, David's resolve hardened. He would face this challenge, even if the entire neighborhood seemed ready to believe the lie. The neighborhood had fallen into an uneasy rhythm, the afternoon sun now softer, stretching long shadows across the trimmed lawns. David paced slowly along the walkway of his front yard, his mind restless despite the calm of the day. The events of the past few days, HOA's enforcers whispering, the accusatory notice pinned to his door, and the heavy stares of neighbors refused to settle. Yet amid this chaos, other, smaller incidents began to resurface in his memory, odd fragments that suddenly felt urgent, A delivery box had appeared on his porch one morning, plain and unremarkable at first glance. He remembered it clearly, the cardboard slightly dented, the tape torn haphazardly, and no note, no signature, no indication of who had left it. David had assumed a mistake, perhaps a package intended for a neighbor, but the timing now gnawed at him. It had arrived the same day the rumors about him had begun circulating. At the time, he had set it aside, brushing off the inconvenience, but now it felt like a small deliberate signal, a seed of something he couldn't yet name. Then there was the man he had seen, loitering near the edge of his backyard at dusk a week ago. He had been tall, shadowed by the fading sunlight, face obscured by the brim of a cap. David remembered the unsettling pause, the deliberate slowness of the figure's movements, as if measuring the yard, memorizing the layout of his home. When David had called out, the man had vanished, slipping into the street with casual indifference, leaving behind only a lingering unease. At the time, it had seemed minor, just another stranger wandering. But with the recent accusations, the memory took on a darker hue. And then there was the trash bin, knocked over in the dead of night, a sight that had startled him awake. Papers and scraps had spilled across the curb, fluttering like ghostly confetti in the dim streetlight. He hadn't put anything inside, had barely touched the bin that day. The neighbors were silent, the street empty, and yet something about the disturbance felt deliberate, purposeful. The experience had left his mind spinning, searching for meaning where there was none. These incidents, seemingly unrelated, twisted together in his mind, forming an invisible web that pressed against his thoughts. David walked slowly, hands brushing along the railing of his porch as if holding onto something tangible could steady his mind. The golden light now slanted low, highlighting the careful order of his yard, each flower, each blade of grass juxtaposed sharply against the creeping disorder of these recent events. Knot of unease had formed deep in his stomach. The pieces did not yet fit together. There was no clear narrative, no concrete threat he could point to. And yet, the instinctive unease gnawed at him, persistent and insistent. Something unseen was at work, threading through the neighborhood with quiet precision. He could feel it in the hesitant glances of passing neighbors, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the faint, inexplicable tremor that had begun in his hands. David stopped near the edge of the porch, letting his eyes roam across the street, down the sidewalk, past the manicured lawns that had once offered comfort. Now, every shadow held the potential for deceit. Every familiar pathway seemed to conceal unknown motives. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the rapid pulse beneath his skin, a mix of fear, frustration, and a stubborn determination not to let the invisible forces unseat him. He did not yet understand the whole picture. He did not yet know who or what had orchestrated these subtle disruptions. But he knew something unmistakable. The calm of his life had been disturbed, and the truth, however hidden, was beginning to claw its way to the surface. The unease was real, and David felt it keenly, as if the very walls of his home had become alert, whispering secrets he could almost, but not entirely decipher. The late afternoon sunlight softened into a warm golden haze, casting long shadows along the quiet suburban street. David stood on his porch, brushing soil from his hands, his mind still heavy with unease from the strange incidents that had been plaguing him. The neighborhood, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a stage for uncertainty. Every distant footstep, every rustle of leaves carried a weight of suspicion he could no longer ignore. It was then that he noticed a figure approaching slowly down the sidewalk. A teenage boy, about 15 or 16, hesitated at the edge of the yard. His posture was tense, shoulders hunched, and his eyes darted nervously between David and the street behind him. David recognized him only vaguely, a neighbor's child who often played in the cul-de-sac. But today, the boy's presence brought a sense of urgency that was impossible to ignore. "David." "Sir?" the boy called softly, voice barely above a whisper. He shuffled closer, hands fidgeting with the hem of his graphic t-shirt, curly hair falling into his eyes. The worry etched into his face was immediate and tangible. David straightened, lowering himself to meet the boy's gaze. "What is it, Jason?" he asked gently, his voice carrying both calm and concern. There was a faint tremor in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and hope, as if the boy might hold the key to unraveling the growing shadow over his life. Jason swallowed hard, glancing behind him as though the street itself might be listening. I saw something. A few nights ago, I was walking my dog near the dumpsters, and someone was placing small bags into your trash bin." His words stumbled over one another, fear and guilt threading through his tone. David's pulse quickened. His stomach lurched, the tension in his chest tightening like a coiled spring. "What do you mean? What kind of bags?" he asked, voice measured but taut with rising urgency. The little plastic ones," Jason said, pointing toward the curb as if that would help recreate the memory. "I couldn't see clearly at first, but I know who it was. I saw him. He's one of the HOA enforcers. The tall man with the blonde hair. He was the one putting them there." David froze, a shiver racing down his spine. His mind struggled to process the revelation, the disparate pieces of recent events snapping into a sudden chilling clarity. The delivery box, the tipped-over trash, the shadowy figure in the backyard, each incident now felt like a thread, and the boy's confession wove them into a pattern he could no longer ignore. The street around him seemed to fade, the golden sunlight and the soft hum of sprinklers giving way to a sudden stark focus on the truth before him. His jaw tightened, hands clenching at his sides. The familiar face of the HOA enforcer, the man who had confronted him with accusations, who had paraded so-called evidence before neighbors, was no longer a symbol of authority in David's eyes, but of deceit and betrayal. Jason looked up at him, wide-eyed and nervous, shifting from foot to foot. I didn't know if I should tell anyone. I was scared," he admitted, voice small against the quiet of the neighborhood. David knelt slightly, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said firmly, gratitude and relief threading through his tone. "Thank you for being honest. You may have just helped me prove the truth." As Jason nodded, a tentative sense of clarity began to replace the gnawing anxiety that had gripped David for days. The shadow of suspicion that had hovered over him began to lift, though it would take more courage and careful steps to fully expose the deception. Yet in that moment, the first ray of truth cut through the darkness, illuminating a path that would soon reveal the betrayal in full. David's eyes scanned the street, the sun painting everything in a golden glow, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a small, cautious breath of hope. The lies could no longer hide forever, not with witnesses, not with evidence, and not with the truth finally emerging into the light. The sunlight slanted low over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the trimmed lawns and the neat brick facades of the suburban homes. David stood on his porch, the earlier revelation from the boy still vivid in his mind, the pulse of truth quickening his heartbeat. But as the golden light stretched across the street, a darker realization began to take shape in his thoughts. This was not random. The HOA enforcer's actions were deliberate. Not just suspicion, not merely a misjudgment. There was a motive beneath the facade, one that made the previous days, events suddenly sinister. David replayed every incident in his mind. The delivery box left mysteriously on his porch, the trash bin knocked over in the dead of night, the shadowy figure lingering near his backyard. Each oddity, each tiny disruption, had seemed isolated at first. But now, connected by the boy's confession, a pattern emerged with chilling clarity. Someone had orchestrated these events, threading a quiet but precise trail meant to unsettle him, to make him doubt the world he had carefully built. The HOA enforcer's face came into focus in David's memory. The tall, stocky man with thinning blonde hair and a clipboard that had always seemed to carry authority. But authority alone could not explain the premeditation, the meticulous planting of evidence, the whispered rumors that spread faster than wildfire. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. This had never been about neighborhood rules, about drugs, or about safety. It was about property. His property. His home. David's stomach tightened. He had heard whispers before about disputes over houses, about the way certain enforcers used their power to manipulate residents into leaving. But he had never imagined it could happen here, in his own quiet, orderly street. The thought that someone could weaponize suspicion, weaponize lies to take what was rightfully his, made the afternoon air feel suffocating, heavy with betrayal. He could almost see the enforcer's calculations, how a carefully planted bag, a torn envelope with his address, and the strategic placement of whispers and glances would combine into a seemingly indisputable narrative. The goal was clear: brand him as a criminal, isolate him socially, erode his support in the community. Once that was achieved, the pressure would mount, subtly at first, until the very foundation of his life, the home he had nurtured, the sanctuary he had built, was under threat. And then, perhaps, a tempting offer to leave. The house sold cheaply to those who had orchestrated the scheme all along. David's hands clenched at his sides. Anger, betrayal, and disbelief coursed through him in waves, yet beneath it all, a steely resolve began to form. He understood now that this was not simply a matter of clearing his name. It was a battle to protect everything he had invested in, every year, every effort, every ounce of care poured into his home and life. He glanced down the street, where neighbors went about their routines, their faces still wary, still influenced by the manufactured suspicion. David knew he would have to act decisively, to gather evidence and witnesses, to turn the tables on the manipulations that had tried to strip him of dignity and security. The afternoon light, once golden and warm, now seemed to cast a sharper, almost accusing glow, illuminating the enforcer's hidden motives in the quiet suburban theater. What had begun as a series of inexplicable events now revealed itself as a calculated attack, a carefully constructed scheme with property as its prize. David exhaled slowly, letting the anger and fear settle into focus. The path ahead would be difficult, but he understood the stakes. This was not just about clearing his name, it was about standing firm, about defending the life he had built against deception and greed. And for the first time in days, a sense of clarity emerged amidst the shadows. He would not yield. Not now, not ever. The morning sun filtered gently through the leaves lining the suburban street, casting dappled shadows on the quiet sidewalks. David moved with purpose, the boy's confession echoing in his mind like a clarion call. Today, he would no longer be passive, no longer allow whispers and insinuations to dictate the story of his life. He had truth on his side, and that truth needed witnesses. First, he stopped at the house across the street. Mrs. Reynolds, a neighbor in her 70s with keen eyes and a love for her security cameras, opened the door with a surprised smile that quickly faded into curiosity when she saw David's determined expression. "Morning, David. Everything all right?" she asked, concern threading through her tone. "I need to show you something," David said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. He explained the series of incidents, the false accusations, and finally, the boy's testimony. Mrs. Reynolds nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "Let's see what my cameras caught," she said, leading him to the monitor in her living room. As the footage flickered to life, David's pulse quickened. There, under the cover of night, the tall, stocky HOA enforcer appeared on the screen. He moved deliberately toward David's trash bin, hands slipping inside the small black bags with a practiced, careful motion. His face, illuminated briefly by the streetlight, confirmed the betrayal. The evidence had been planted. David's chest tightened with a mixture of vindication and lingering fury. But David did not stop there. He visited Mr. Harris, a retired lawyer a few houses down, whose calm demeanor had always radiated quiet authority. Explaining the situation with measured urgency, David watched as Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed at the description of the events. "We can compile this," the lawyer said, voice firm. "We have proof, witness statements, and now this footage. There's no room for denial." Finally, David contacted the local journalist, a woman known for her dedication to uncovering injustice. She listened intently, her pen moving rapidly over her notebook. "If this story is true," she said, "it will shake the neighborhood. People will see what's really been happening." By midday, the evidence was gathered and ready. David returned home, the weight in his chest replaced by a flicker of anticipation. Slowly, neighbors began to notice a shift, a quiet buzz, whispers of what might be true. Those who had avoided him, who had looked away or murmured in judgment, now found themselves witnesses to the unraveling of a lie. In a small assembly on the street, David stood with Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Harris, and the journalist by his side. The footage played on a laptop, the image of the enforcer sneaking through the shadows, planting bags undeniable in its clarity. Gasps punctuated the silence, hands covering mouths, eyes widening with shock. The neighborhood that had once been complicit, even if passively, now watched the facade collapse. Faces that had once carried doubt, suspicion, or judgment shifted, some to shame, others to awe at David's resilience. The enforcer, pale and caught in the act, realized the magnitude of exposure. The lie that had threatened to strip David of dignity and home had been illuminated in broad daylight, revealed with irrefutable proof. David felt a deep exhale, a quiet release of tension, though not entirely free from the sting of what had occurred. Yet he knew the day had changed everything. The truth had found its witnesses, the injustice was laid bare, and his life, his reputation, and his home were no longer at the mercy of falsehood. As the sun climbed higher, the neighborhood hummed with the weight of revelation. Shadows of suspicion receded, leaving in their place a powerful, undeniable lesson. Lies, no matter how carefully planted, could never withstand the light of truth. The late afternoon sun dipped low, painting the neighborhood in warm shades of gold and amber. Shadows stretched lazily across the sidewalks, highlighting the meticulous lawns and blooming flower beds that David had tended for years. For the first time in weeks, the street felt familiar again, not a stage for whispers, suspicion, or quiet judgment, but a space that reflected calm, resilience, and justice finally restored. The HOA enforcer, once a looming figure of intimidation, had been confronted with irrefutable evidence. His false accusations crumbled, his lies exposed before neighbors and authorities alike. He faced consequences, official reprimands, and investigations that would ensure such abuse of authority could not repeat. The weight that had pressed on David's chest for so long, the uncertainty, the fear, the gnawing dread of losing his home and reputation began to lift. David did not celebrate loudly. There was no triumphal display, no grand announcement. Instead, he moved quietly, methodically as he often had, tending to the little details of his home and yard. He straightened the porch railing, brushed a few stray leaves from the walkway, and paused to look at the flowers he had planted, each one vibrant and alive, proof of his care and dedication. He stepped onto the front porch and stood there, hands lightly resting on the railing, gazing across the street at the familiar houses bathed in the soft glow of sunset. His chest felt lighter, but more than that, a quiet pride filled him, an affirmation that integrity and patience, even under duress, could withstand the darkest of storms. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves above, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and flowers, and for a moment, the world felt in balance again. Slowly, tentative steps approached his porch. Neighbors who had once avoided his gaze, who had whispered behind closed doors, or quickened their pace past his home, now stopped. Their expressions were hesitant, shy, and tinged with shame. A middle-aged woman with a basket of laundry offered a soft, almost uncertain smile. "David, I'm sorry," she said quietly, eyes lowered, voice barely above a whisper. Others followed, murmurings of regret threading through the golden air. David met their apologies with a steady gaze, his expression calm but kind. He did not demand acknowledgement. He did not need to. The mere act of standing firm, of reclaiming his truth, had spoken louder than words. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone measured but warm, accepting their recognition without anger or bitterness. Across the street, children rode their bikes as if nothing had changed. Sprinklers arced lazily over the grass, and a dog barked at the fading light of day. Yet the air felt different, lighter, filled with a subtle awareness of fairness and restored dignity. David's home, once a place shadowed by suspicion, now radiated calm authority, a sanctuary that no lie could touch. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, David lingered on his porch. His shoulders were squared, his posture quiet and dignified, a man who had faced injustice and emerged intact. In the eyes of his neighbors, in the steady rhythm of the neighborhood, he saw the reflection of truth prevailing. The shadows of doubt and deception had passed, leaving a clarity that was both peaceful and profound. And in that moment, David understood that victory was not loud or flashy. It was found in resilience, in integrity, and in the unwavering knowledge that one could stand firm, even when the world seemed determined to see them fall. The sun dipped below the horizon, but its light lingered on him, steady, proud, and unbroken. The evening had settled into a quiet, reflective calm. The golden hues of sunset faded into soft purples and pinks, and the neighborhood exhaled after days of tension and whispered suspicions. David stood on his porch, hands resting lightly on the railing, watching the sky shift and the shadows lengthen. The world around him had returned to its familiar rhythm. Children's laughter drifted from yards nearby. Sprinklers clicked steadily, and the faint scent of cut grass lingered in the air. But the weight of what had transpired lingered in his mind. He thought about the thin line between authority and power, how injustice often wears a uniform, a badge, or even a confident tone to cloak its intent. The HOA enforcer, with his rigid posture and self-appointed authority, had seemed untouchable at first, a symbol of rules enforced without question. Yet beneath that facade had been a calculated attempt to disrupt, to intimidate, and to steal. It was a vivid reminder that power alone does not equal truth, and that vigilance is essential. Even in the most seemingly ordinary corners of life, lies can spread quickly. David reflected, faster than he had ever imagined. One whispered rumor, one piece of fabricated evidence, had the ability to ripple outward and touch every neighbor, altering perceptions in subtle, corrosive ways. The neighborhood, once warm and familiar, had grown cold under the weight of unexamined suspicion. But as the days unfolded, as the boy's voice spoke the truth and Mrs. Reynolds' cameras revealed the deception, it became clear that truth, though slower, had a way of working through the noise. It may take time, patience, and courage, but it ultimately pierces the veil of falsehood. David's gaze fell to his home, the place that had been at the center of so much turmoil. Home is more than walls, more than a yard or a mailbox. It is the repository of memories, of small victories and quiet moments of care. It is dignity, woven into every flower planted, every repair made, every meal shared across a kitchen table. To threaten it is to threaten the essence of a person's life. And yet, standing there, David felt the quiet triumph of having preserved it, not through confrontation alone, but through truth, persistence, and a refusal to yield to fear. He thought too of the boy who had stepped forward, voice trembling but firm, and how that small act of courage had shifted everything. Sometimes it is a single voice, unexpected and vulnerable, that can unmask deceit and restore justice. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it hesitates, yet it can create ripples strong enough to overturn schemes and reveal what is right. David exhaled slowly, letting the lessons of the past days settle into his bones. The sun had nearly vanished behind the horizon, casting a serene twilight over the neighborhood. He felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, not from vengeance or confrontation, but from knowing that integrity had endured, that justice, however delayed, had arrived. In the lingering glow, David understood a profound truth. Life would always present moments of challenge, moments when lies and fear threaten to overshadow what is real and just. But with patience, courage, and a steadfast belief in what is right, even the most powerful falsehoods can be illuminated and dismantled. He stood on his porch, steady and reflective, a man who had weathered the storm and emerged with dignity intact, a living testament to the enduring power of truth and courage.